First question that arises in our mind is that why do we need to have a nervous system? See, the body of an animal frequently encounters changes within its environment, either internal or external. To respond appropriately to the particular change, different body parts are to work together and their activities are coordinated. Now, this coordination is brought about by the nervous system. Let's take an example. If a person steps on a sharp object while walking, he feels pain and his hand immediately reaches the site of injury. How? Stepping up on a sharp object, feeling of pain, and then responding by immediately withdrawal of the foot and the hand reaching the injured site involves coordination. The other question that arises is if the nervous system is coordinating, how does it do that? How does the nervous system coordinates all body functions? The nervous system is capable of detecting the changes in the environment, that is, the internal and external changes, and then producing the response accordingly to the change. This coordinated action has five components, that is, the stimulus, the receptor, coordinator, effector, and the response. Let's start with the stimulus. Any change in the environment, internal or external, which is detected by the receptors, that is, your sense organs, to initiate a nerve impulse or a signal, is called a stimulus. For example, heat, pressure, sound waves, light, odor, these are all examples of the stimuli. Receptor, on the other hand, are specialized organs, tissues, or cells which are capable of detecting the changes, detecting the stimuli, and hence are known as receptors. For example, the photoreceptors, they are specialized to detect the stimulus of light. The olfactory receptors detect odor. Thermoreceptors detect changes in the temperature. Pain receptors are the nociceptors which are detecting the stimulus of pain. These are all different examples of the receptors, and there are many more. Coordinator, on the other hand, are the organs which are supposed to coordinate, that is, they receive the information from the receptors which have detected the change, and then they interpret and analyze the information, and then they send the messages to the particular organs for appropriate functions. The coordinators are brain and the spinal cord, that is, the components of the central nervous system. The effectors, on the other hand, are the parts of the body which receive the messages from the coordinators. That is, once the coordinators they have analyzed and processed the information, they send the message to the effectors, and the effectors accordingly produce a particular response. Muscles and glands of the body act as effectors. On receiving the message from the coordinators, these effectors performs an appropriate action. This action is called a response. For example, when somebody touches a very hot object, he or she quickly pulls away the hand. The pulling away of the hand is an example of response. What we have studied so far is that after a receptor receives a stimulus, that is the change, it transmits the information in the form of electrochemical waves to the coordinators, that is the brain and the spinal cord. And these coordinators analyzes and processes the message and then transmit the information to the effectors to produce an appropriate response. Now let's look at an example. What happens when you touch a very hot object? You quickly pull your hand away, right? Why? Let me explain. When someone touches a very hot object, the receptors in your hand they are stimulated, particularly in your skin. The nerve impulses are then transmitted from the receptors to the coordinator, that is the spinal cord. The spinal cord analyzes the information and then it sends the message to the effectors via specialized cells, which we will be discussing in detail later. In turn, the effectors, that is the muscles of the arm, they respond. How do they respond? They respond by pulling away of your hand. That is, the muscles contract in response, and this causes you to pull your hand away. Now let's study the divisions of the human nervous system. The human nervous system has two basic components, the mainstream central nervous system and then the connecting peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system has two basic parts, the brain and the spinal cord, which we've studied earlier, act as the coordinator. Whereas the peripheral nervous system consists of network of nerves, and these nerves are very important as they connect the central nervous system to all parts of the body. Now, the main question that arises in our mind immediately is that what constitutes the nervous system? The basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system is the neuron or the nerve cell. You have already studied its detail earlier. Let's quickly recall its basic components. The neuron consists of cell body and the cytoplasmic projections. These cytoplasmic projections include dendrites and axons. The nervous system helps to sense things around us. Neuron is also known as the nerve cell and is a basic building block of the nervous system. Now let us understand the components of the neuron. There are three components: cell body or soma, the dendrites, and the axon. Let us understand each component one by one. The cell body consists of a granular cytoplasm and a single large nucleus. Dendrites are short projections or extensions that stretch out of the cell body. Whereas the axon is a long thread-like projection of the neuron. It has an insulating and protective sheath called the myelin sheath, which is very important for the transmission of nerve impulse. The dendrites are short and thin, often highly branched cytoplasmic extensions that tapers from bases to the tips. Their function is to receive the message and carry it towards the cell body. Whereas the axons, on the other hand, they're comparatively long and thick nerve fibers and they terminate by branching to form small extensions with enlarged ends called the synaptic knobs or the synaptic terminals. Now, their function is to carry the nerve impulse or the message away from the cell body. The important question is, how do neurons coordinate? They receive the impulses, as we studied earlier, then they integrate the incoming signals, they communicate the signals to the target cells. Now, let's just recall, how do they receive the impulses? From the receptors. Where do they integrate the incoming signals? Via the coordinator. And how do they communicate the signals to the target cells? Via the neurons to the effectors, which are supposed to produce an appropriate response. Neurons transmit these messages or signals in the form of electromagnetic waves called the nerve impulses. The impulses are transferred from the dendrites towards the cell body and then from the cell body, from the axons away from the cell body to another neuron. Now let's study the types of neurons. Neurons are classified into three different types on the basis of the function they perform. That is sensory neuron, motor neuron, and interneuron. The sensory neuron is also known as the afferent neuron. It consists of one dendrite and one axon, And why it is known as afferent neuron? Because it carries the impulses from the sense organs towards the central nervous system. Motor neuron, on the other hand, has many dendrites but one axon, and they are known as the efferent neurons because they carry the impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors, whereas the interneurons, which makes up the central nervous system, are also known as the relay or associated neurons. They consist of many dendrites and many axons, and they are there to link the sensory and the motor neurons. If we look at the figure, we can clearly look at the structure. The sensory neuron, which is present at the top, is transmitting the nerve impulse from the sense organ towards the brain and the spinal cord. The neuron which is constituting the brain and the spinal cord consists of many dendrites and many axons, and that is, they are the interneurons. Whereas from the coordinator, the messages or the impulses are carried to the third type of the neuron, which is the motor neuron, which carries it towards the muscles, that is the effector for creating the response. The three neurons, they differ in their structure. If we clearly look at the picture, the sensory neuron has a single dendrite, that is dendron, and a single axon. And then they are carrying the nerve impulses towards another type of neuron, that is the interneuron, which is constituting the brain and the spinal cord, which consists of many dendrites and many axons. And after the interpretation and the analyzation of the information, the impulses is carried to the third neuron, which is different in structure as it consists of many dendrites but a single axon. Now let's study the example again that we studied earlier. What happens when somebody touches a very hot object? The receptors in the skin sends the nerve impulse via the sensory neuron, which carries the impulse towards the coordinator, that is the interneurons, which are constituting the brain and the spinal cord. And after the interpretation and analyzation, the interneurons send the message to the motor neuron, which carries it towards the muscles in the arm, which contract, pulling your arm and hand away. I hope that you have grasped all the concepts, and I wish that you listen to this video again and again and try and solve all the activity based questions which are henceforth.